Good day. Good day. I'd like to greet Dr. Mario Pasion, the professor in the subject Trends and Issues in the Philippine Education. Also, I'd like to thank Ma'am Jeneline Austria for facilitating this interview and um, allowing me to share my insights on the issues and possible recommendations that we may take into action, that we may put into action, particularly in the current situation of the educational system amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Mark Angelo Biabinsay. I'm currently affiliated with the Armed Forces of the Philippines Corps of Professors. Prior to this, I have served the Department of Education Central Office in various capacities as technical assistant to the Undersecretary, Project Development Officer, and Officer in charge of the External Partnership Service. I've also had various engagements as education and governance consultants with select local government units and then non-government organizations. First up, I would like to share some of my insights, particularly on the situation of education or general our education system in general. In the field of curriculum and instruction and governance. First off, in terms of curriculum and instruction, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic have posed a myriad of challenges, particularly in implementing our intended curriculum. In the case of basic education, it's a K-12 curriculum, and for the higher education, the corresponding curricula approved by the Commission on Higher Education, and those that were developed or prescribed by different higher education institutions with the autonomous status. But in my studying, I'll be focusing more on the basic education sector, in which I am more familiar with, and I've had several engagement and a notable experience when it comes to curriculum and instruction and governance in basic education. So for curriculum and instruction, in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have encountered or we may have heard the most essential learning competencies or MELC. This was the move of the Department of Education in trying to trim down the learning competencies or the essential learning competencies in the K to 12 curriculum. So it was good that the initiative started prior to the pandemic, and maybe it was finally also that they were able to complete the review of the curriculum and the competencies in time for COVID-19 pandemic. So it was we're able to streamline the learning competencies. Alongside with that, around 2016 and 17, the Department of Education has started several initiatives to strengthen flexible learning options or FLO. This was commonly known before as alternative education or non-formal education. But the politically correct term, or if I may say, the commonly used term for this is FLO, as also used by other educational systems across the globe. Also, instituted several policies and guidelines in terms of the K-12 assessment. We have also strengthened differentiated instruction and other forms of assessment for us to really see how we have achieved several learning competencies and the learning outcomes in general. So putting all these into context, we may have observed that the resiliency of our curriculum and instruction have been tested by the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of the MELC, we may have streamlined the learning competencies. However, we've had difficulties in terms of the learning was supposedly the next phase the most learning competencies also streamline learning. Yes, I will say that. I am having some internet connectivity problems. So as I was saying, in terms of the flexible learning options, it was good that we have already instituted certain parameters and standards for this. As such, we have already set standards for home-based learning or homeschooling, those who are undergoing tutorial lessons or those who are enrolled in tutorial centers, and other forms of non-formal education or alternative education, as in the case of ALS, Lamisosa, and Open High School. We may all know that we have had these programs prior when we had the non-formal, Bureau for Non-Formal Education. And it's good that with the policies for the flexible learning options, we have already taken into consideration the new context, the K-12 curriculum, and the ELS enhanced curriculum, and how we can deliver all this using different learning options with the FLO policy. Then for the assessment, as mentioned a while ago, we have already instituted several forms of assessment alongside with differentiated instruction, taking into consideration the multiple intelligence of our learners. So those were my thoughts in terms of curriculum and instructions. In terms of governance, I would like to underscore the importance of collaborative governance in our basic education system. Though in Republic Act 9155 or the Basic Education Governance Act of 2001, governance was defined in terms of being shared across the different levels in DepEd. That being said, the governance or the management of schools, including the implementation of the curriculum, is a shared responsibility from the central office down to the regional office to the schools division office, and in some cases, in the district office, down at the school level. So that was the concept of governance when that is the concept of governance if you will really look at the details of that Republic Act. However, given the different initiatives also when we highlighted partnerships for basic education, we have strengthened our engagement with local government units, the private sector, non-government organization, as well as our Parents Teachers Association. So those are the different entities and stakeholders that we have to deal with in governing our basic education system. However, there were some policies that were construed to be more DepEd centric rather than being more collaborative. That is in the case of our school governing council. That's why we've had a manual for SGC. However, we didn't have any policy cover for that. So we've had and review for that particular policy. And it may be good to know that soon they will be releasing the new policies in school governing council. So there were some issues when it comes to how open are we in letting our stakeholders contribute or suggest or recommend in managing our schools, in delivering our curriculum, and making sure that we have achieved the learning outcomes among our students and taking into consideration their well-being. So that was really the main contention in terms of the governance in basic education. Aside from that, in terms of partnership, the another issue would be how do we translate partnership into learning outcomes, or how do we measure the contribution of partnerships in achieving our learning outcomes. In one of my studies, I found out in the case of some of the school-based management level 3 schools in the division, in one of the divisions in Calabarzon, that also, this is also an observation across, I would say across the country, whenever we do technical assistance and field visits in various regions and divisions. The main strategy for partnerships would be solicitation. So there is that tendency of donors fatigue and the of doing the solicitation in terms of companionship or tapping all those within your social capital or within your circles. So that's actually an interesting but quite alarming observation, because what we all do whenever we do solicitations, there may be some considerations for the resources of the entity we are soliciting from, and that of our capacity to make that resources contributory to our school improvement and achieving the learning outcomes among our learners. So that's one of the observations and findings that we've had in terms of partnership strategy. Another consideration or another findings that we found is that the type of organization is not that contributory to achieving collaborative governance. So it will not guarantee that if you include as many non-government organization representatives in your school governing council or in managing your school will yield to higher NAT scores or achievement of the school improvement targets, etc. So the type of organization is not contributory to that. What is contributory is the capacity to collaborate. So in the case of the private sector, does that align with their business interests and that of their corporate social responsibility agenda? As in the case of the local government units, aside from their mandate, as in the case of the special education funds, how does it contribute to the overall human resource development for their locality, okay, and their constituency in general? And then for the non-government organizations, how does learning outcomes and the priorities of the education sector contribute or augment the achievements of their advocacies? So those are the considerations when we look at how we approach education governance by engaging several sectors and identified stakeholders for basic education. So, given all those observations and findings, um, particularly for curriculum and instruction, what I put forward during the height of the pandemic was a technical note on education resource generation that actually combines several recommendations for curriculum and instruction and governance, particularly on resource generation. So I've had a mnemonic device for that. First, in making sure that we have the necessary resources for us to implement our learning continuity plans and make sure that what we have developed in the Curriculum and Instruction Bureau for the COVID-19 pandemic will be realized down at the school level. We have to make sure that we have the necessary resources. And we have to take note that during that time, there were some delays or difficulties in downloading the funds or identifying um, the items necessary to implement the learning continuity plan. So what happened during that time is that um, the initial response was initiated at the school and division level, and it was maybe several months after that the national government funding were downloaded to the necessary units. So with that kind of situation, what we need would be mask as we usually as we usually need in this COVID pandemic. So M stands for making an inventory of resources. A stands for aligning priorities. S stands for sustaining communication, and K stands for keeping track of partnership. So for M, making an inventory of resources, we have to consider what we have, what can we purchase out of our MOE to realize our learning continuity plan? What competencies do we have among our faculty members? And what capacity do we have in terms of implementing such plan? Aside from that, we also have to consider what else do we need? What are the gaps in terms of resources? And when we say resources, it does not only talk about financial resources. Okay? Also take into consideration human, moral, social, organizational, and cultural resources. So it is only when we make an inventory that we can strategize well and manage our resources more effectively and efficiently in implementing our LCP. Next would be aligning priorities. As I mentioned earlier, the LGUs will have their agenda for their constituency in terms of socioeconomic programs, as in the case of education. We also have the business sector, but what is unique now, the business sector is also affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there were also some limitations in terms of the resources of the private sector. Then we have our Parents Teachers Association. So this is in the form of strengthening the role of parents in the learning of our students. So we have to extend our role as facilitators of learning among our parents. The question would be, prepared are they, or do they have the necessary capacity to do such role of facilitating learning? For letter S, we also have to sustain communication. So we were forced to embrace the different technological platforms available to us, as in the case of social media, television, radio, internet, and even the traditional posters and bulletin boards. So we have to sustain and make use of those communication platforms so that we can somehow ensure that our message, our targeted audience, and these are our parents and learners. For letter K, we also have to keep track of partnerships. So one faulty consequence of engaging solicitation is that it is one-sided. It does not benefit the other group or the other party. Sometimes this is only a one-time engagement, so it is not sustained. So therefore, it is very important to keep track of the partnership. What we usually lack is we somehow fail to inform the donors or the stakeholders what happened after they donated or after they have given us certain resources. So that's for mass. So those are the practices that we have to make sure that our governance in basic education really enables our curriculum and instruction initiatives. And moving forward in the new normal, um, we have I have also written a material on this and put forward a strategy called DOSE. D stands for Designing a Partnership Dashboard. O, Optimizing Digital Engagement. S, Safeguarding Partnerships. And E, Ensuring Local Economic Integration. So this somehow augments the Build Back Better initiatives for the education sector in general. So for letter D, designing a partnership dashboard, we now have existing information systems in the Department of Education, such as the Learners Information System, the Learning Resources Management Information System. However, those are just part integrated information systems that were planned several years back. But having a dashboard will somehow give us an easier overview and way to understand the different data that we have in terms of implementing our curriculum, engaging partners, and trying to measure other governance parameters in basic education. Okay, so we have already witnessed how easier it is if we look at data using dashboards. So we can now locate that, or we can now access that using several websites trying to show where the COVID cases are. So those features can also be used in communicating different education data, as well as the status and monitoring of our programs and projects. For letter O, we have to optimize digital engagement. So the question would be, are we going back to the traditional ways of teaching? If coming months, hopefully, we'll be able to go back to normal, or we really have to embrace the new normal. So with that, we may have really to optimize digital engagements aside from the social media. There are now also trends of gamification or transforming learning activities into games to maximize learning. We also have different chatbots or automated chats that were being used now in certain to assist parents facilitating learning. So those are some innovations arising from various digital engagements in our new normal. For letter S, we now have to safeguard better our partnership. So we now have the use of e-monies, online donation platforms. However, the thieves are also advancing their strategy. So if we post something online, particularly our accounts, school accounts for our donation drives or certain initiatives, there were tendencies or cases that they change the mobile numbers of the account numbers. So we have to strengthen our online security, even for our learners. That is also the most important aspect of online those undergoing the online learning. Okay, so aside from protecting their photos, their information, their login credentials, we also have to protect their information, particularly concerning our governance and partnership initiative. So that's for letter S. And lastly, for letter E, in trying to respond to the new normal, we have to ensure local economic integration. We all know that all sectors were affected. We have seen downward trends in our economic data and economic performance. So at the local level, it is where we can engage more because the local economic integration or local economic development is somehow shared among the LGUs and that of the education sector, the business sector, or those businesses in the community or nation existing in such location. So, in trying to build back better, what will be the role of education sector for us to resilient and somehow to be now sustainable so that whenever we encounter, and hopefully not in the near future, but whenever we encounter another crisis, we can make sure that education continues and that education complements our local economic development. So we have this may be a great opportunity to review are the offerings that we have in the senior high school really support the businesses around our school, or it's just that we offer those tracks just for the convenience or just for the availability of resources in our schools or in our community. So that's another consideration for local economic integration. Lastly, we also have to make sure that our recovery plans in education already addresses that of the competencies, the learning options, the new assessments, and the overall governance strategies that we have. So, in closing, maybe I'd like to say this saying author. A wise physician said, the best medicine for humans is love. Then someone asked, what if it doesn't work? He smiled and answered, increase the dose. So we may be still um, trying to adapt with the COVID-19 pandemic, but for our love in the education sector, all we need to do maybe is to improve our dose of innovations and of facing new strategies and implementing those for us to better achieve learning outcomes and to make sure overall well-being of learners are taken into consideration. So again, thank you very much, Marine and Dr. Mario, for giving me this opportunity to somehow share some of my insights in our basic education system. Have a good day.